Many a long year ago, several miles outside the city of Bremen, there lived Otto, a very elderly farm dog, who, since he had been a puppy, had served the farmer and his wife with tremendous loyalty. He had learnt to round up sheep and round up goats and chickens and ducks and geese. He'd learnt to guard the farm from intruders and trespassers. You name it, he had learnt to do it. He was a veritable lassie with a dog when it came to performing all manner of tasks and tricks. And over the years he had picked up quite a lot of German. And people might assume that dogs have very limited understandings of human languages, sit, roll over, fetch, that kind of thing. But it's simply not true. Now, whilst dogs may not have the necessary capacity to speak human languages, they do understand a hell of a lot of them. And Otto was quite exceptional in the level of understanding he had. Now, he knew that whenever he smelt the farmer's wife cooking, as he smelt today, if he waited at the kitchen door, not going in because that would annoy her because she'd been up tripping over him, but just to wait at the kitchen door, looking pleadingly at her, wagging his tail, lolling his tongue, he would invariably be given scraps from the cooking. And this is exactly what he did when he got that wonderful aroma that she was in the process of whipping up something lovely for dinner. So off he trotted, although it has to be said a rather slow trot these days because he was very elderly, and parked himself at the kitchen door. And he heard the farmer lumbering down the stairs, plonking his enormous backside into a chair at the kitchen table, which creaked and strained beneath him. And at first it was the usual conversations that the farmer and his wife had, local gossip about who said what to who and where and when, and then moaning and groaning about government policies and taxation on corn and on milk and on one thing and another. But then the conversation started to change and to turn, and it moved on to the topic of the dog. Now, Otto had long since stopped thinking of himself as the dog, and had come to think of himself as a member of this human family. But he was reminded in more uncertain terms that he was indeed the dog, as the conversation took a rather bleak turn. Now, at first, they were a little nostalgic, talking of when Otto had been young and fit and energetic and all of the wonderful things he had done. But then, from nostalgia, they slid into disappointment about how old he was getting, how frail he was getting. The farmer's wife moaned about the bad smells and the handfuls of fur that were being left all over the house. And the farmer moaned about how slow Otto was these days at rounding up the sheep and the chickens and the ducks and all of the rest of it, and how when intruders walked past the farm with ill intent in their eyes gazing at the farmer's property, Otto would woof at them, but in a rather frail way, and given that he only had 3 teeth left in his head, what real use would Otto be if somebody did indeed break into the farm? And eventually the farmer's wife said, well, why don't we get a puppy? Which did not please Otto. A puppy we can train up, he can learn new skills, he will be quick and fast and able to do all the things that Otto could do when he was young. A good choice, said the farmer. And for Otto himself? Well, said the farmer's wife, maybe we should talk to the vet. Ah, vet, said the farmer. They cost too much. No, no. I will take Otto out to the woods and bash on the head with a brick, down the well, boom, job done. Well, Otto was mortified. All those years of service and loyalty and devotion to, well, he'd not stopped thinking of them as owners or as employers, and thought of them as family. But they clearly did not think of him as family. They thought of him as a burden, a financial drain, that it would be so much better just to bash him on the head and throw him down the well than feed him and water him and look after him in his twilight years. Well, thought Otto, I'm not staying on this wretched farm a day longer, because whilst the farmer may be saying I'll do it at the weekend, there's no guarantee he'll wait till the weekend before bumping me off. This very day I will leave. So Otto went and he found a handkerchief, and he put into the handkerchief his lead and his collar and his favourite chew toy, and tied it up and put it over his shoulder on a stick, and off he went down the lanes. No real idea, of course, where he was going, until he reached a signpost. Sadly, it was written in German, and whilst Otto could speak, couldn't speak it, but he could understand German, he couldn't read it. Not without his reading glasses on anyway, he'd left those at the farm. So he didn't know which directions the various arrows were pointing in, but he thought Bremen was in that direction. He had a dim memory of somebody once saying it was in that direction. And so that's the country lane he took himself off down. And he had been going down that lane for maybe about 2 miles or so, when he heard a rather heavy sigh coming from a few yards ahead. And up he trotted and looked up, and there was a big old greyish, blackish head of a donkey. He went again. And Otto said, "My friend, why are you so sad?" And it may come as a surprise to some of you, but not to others, that animals do indeed share a universal language. And the donkey said, my friend, this day, after years and years and years of hard service to my farmer, fetching and carrying and lugging and hauling carts and big bundles and taking things to market and bringing them back again and fertilising his fields and Lord knows what else he's asked me to do over the years, do you know what I heard him say to me? Otto thought, that you're too old and he's going to bash you on the head with a brick and throw you down the well. No, said the donkey. Well, the too old part, yes. But how would I fit down a well? I mean, look at the size of it. No, he said that I'm far too old and he's going to get a much younger donkey to pull his carts and lug his weights. And the farmer's wife suggested, you know what she suggested? She suggested they should take me to the knacker's yard and have me turned into glue and at least make some money on my old bones. All these years of service from my so-called family, and all they can do is think of money and converting my corpse into money. That's all I'm worth to them. Same with my lot, said the dog. Disgusting, these humans. Not a shred of loyalty, not a shred of decency amongst them. Well, you know what you should do, my friend? What? Said the donkey. Join me. Join me in my journey to Bremen. And what are you going to do when you get to Bremen? Asked the donkey. Well, I've often heard my, ex-owner, as he is now, moaning and groaning about the city of Bremen, saying how brazen and shocking people are there, how they have no values and morals and standards, that it's a city full of actors and artists and musicians and wanton strumpets. Are you going to become a wanton strumpet? Asked the donkey. Well, not at my age, said the dog, but I thought maybe I could be an artist's model. People like painting pictures of dogs, after all. Or maybe I could be an actor. I could join the movies. I mean, I've seen Lassie on the TV. I could do that. It's very hard to break into movies, said the donkey. Is there anything else you can do? And Otto thought for a while. He said, well, I'm quite good at howling. And he threw back his head and howled to demonstrate the skill. And the donkey said, you are very good at howling. I wish I was good at making howling noises, but I'm not really. What I can do is drum my hooves. And he demonstrated and knocked out a rhythm. And I said, well, Bremen is full of musicians. Why don't we form a duo? You do the drumming and I'll do the singing. Sorted. We can go off and be the next Eurovision entry. Couldn't be any worse than some of them, could we? And so the two of them agreed. The donkey kicked the fence off its hinges, made his way out through the gap, and the two of them continued on down the country lanes, chatting merrily for several miles, until, turning a bend in the road, they came upon a very, very miserable, dejected-looking cockerel sitting on a fence post, with the most terrible moping expression on its face. And at once the two animals said to it, "What on earth is wrong with you? You look so despairing." "Ah," said the cockerel, "all my years I've lived on this farm since I was hatched, and I've done my very best for the family here. I've fertilised all of their chickens 100 times over. I've given them eggs left, right and centre, and chicks all over the place. I've crowed up the sun in the morning and woken them up ready for their day's work, year in, year out. And yesterday I heard the farmer saying I'm too damned old, and do you know what they said they'd do? Bash you on the head and chuck you down the well," said Otto. "Slit your throat and make you into glue," said Heinz the donkey. No, none of that. No, the farmer's wife said she was going to take a hatchet, chop my head off and put me in the cooking pot, that that's all I was fit for anymore, and they could go out and get a young cockerel to do my job instead. I asked you all of these years of service, and I'm not even a family member, I'm just dinner for them. It's practically cannibalism, eating one of your own. It's disgusting. These humans have no morals whatsoever." And the other two animals thoroughly agreed. And after a good old gripe, the three of them decided that instead of being a musical duo, they would become a musical trio, because Ludwig with the cockerel demonstrated his crowing, his cock-a-doodle-doing, and so impressed the other two they thought they could have two singers in a drum. And off they'd go, all the way to Bremen, and then all the way to stardom. Get a record deal, maybe. Well, they'd been trudging along another 4 or 5 miles, and their hooves and their paws and their claws were beginning to get really rather sore, and the day was drawing on and it was getting a little gloomier, when up ahead they saw a sorry sight. Sitting in the middle of the road, the soggiest moggy they had ever laid eyes on. An old ginger cat looking miserable and dank and wet and dripping, and bits of pondweed here and there. And they said to the poor old feline, "What on earth has happened to you? Have you fallen in the river or something?" "Ah," said the dog, "I bet somebody's bashed you on the head with a brick and thrown you down the well." "Nearly," said the cat, "very, very nearly. You're almost right there. You know, that mill over yonder, I was born there, as my mother was before me and her mother before her, and every generation of us, we've served that family as loyal can be. We've hunted the mice and the rats, we've sat on their lap at the end of the day and purred them into a restful state when they've been tired and exhausted. We've done everything in our power to serve that family, and do you know what? Only yesterday the miller's wife decided I was too old and too slow and nigh on toothless and no good for chasing mice anymore, so she grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, shoved me into a leather sack, took me down to the river with a brick in the sack and threw me in to drown me, saying as she was leaving that she'd go and get some kittens to do the job far more speedily instead. And if it wasn't for these claws, I would indeed have drowned, but I ripped my way out of that bag, paddled my way to shore, and here you see me now. But a few minutes later, my God, attempted murder, that's what it was. All those years of loyalty to my so-called family, and what do? They try and murder me." And all of the other animals agreed it was disgusting, and typical of these humans, that they had no morals, no decency, they knew no better in their treatment of their loyal and devoted, well, you can't say family anymore, can you? Because you don't treat family like that. So what were they? Employees, drudges, slaves? What on earth to these humans were their donkeys and their dogs and their cockerels and their cats and all of their various other animals? Who can say? And so on for a few more miles they trudged, For the cat Gretel, on hearing the plans of the other three animals to go and form a trio and perform music in Bremen, offered her own services at caterwauling and demonstrated how she was an even better singer than Yoko Ono, that she could hold a record as well. And offered that maybe, with her claws she might be quite good at the piano or something like that. She could learn because, as Otto said, you're just never too old to teach an old dog new tricks, or indeed an old cat. So off they were going. Bremen in their sights, well, not literally, but in the general direction of their ambitions. But it was getting awfully dark now, and whilst that wasn't a great problem for the animals, because they could see in the dark, nonetheless they were very tired, and the cat was very wet, and they were all very hungry, and they'd like a good rest and something to eat. Where can we go? Yeah, we can't risk going to another farm, because you know what these farmers are like, they all talk, and they'll probably try and pack us off back where we came from, and we'll all be bumped off. The donkey, being the tallest of them all, could see further afield than the rest, and he said, "Up in the woods over there I can see some lights flickering. That must be either firelight or candlelight. There must be something over there." "Oh, if it's a farm, we shouldn't risk it," said the chicken, cockerel. But the other said, well, maybe it might be one of the nicer humans. There were some nice humans around. It might be someone who would take care of them, and maybe they should just check it out. If nothing else, there might be at least a barn they could rest in without disturbing the farmer, and then be off at first light before the farmer woke up and noticed them. So they crept up towards the source of the flickering lights. And there they found not a farm with a barn, but a very humble-looking cottage. A cottage that frankly had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the windows were cracked in places, the door was hanging a bit askew, there were tiles missing off the roof. It could do with a real makeover. And they ummed and they ahed as to should they knock on the door, should they call out, should they do this, should they do that. But it was the donkey who said, well, why don't I go up and just peer through the window, because I'm tall enough to look through the windows, and I can at least find out, is this a farm or is it a little old lady? Who on earth is it in here? So the old donkey Heinz clip-clopped up as quietly as he could and put a bleary eye to the window, one of them, and peered through the pane. And there he saw not a little old lady, but a bunch of men sitting round a table, and on the table, as well as a few candles which was creating the glow, there were piles of coins and stacks of banknotes, and there were sacks with who knew what in on the floor, and the men were smoking and drinking and laughing and bragging about how they had acquired this money. One of them laughing about how frightened some little old lady had looked when they'd threatened to cut her throat if she didn't part with her life savings, and the other laughing his socks off about how they'd managed to make away with a great big stash of silver and gold and plate from a church, and another one bragging about his robberies and how they'd all amassed the fortune that was piled up on the table. Well, the donkey was so busy listening that the others were getting restless, and the cat scrabbled up the donkey's back and sat up there so she could peer through the window. And the cockerel also got fed up and flew up and perched on the donkey's head so he could peer through the window. And the dog, old Otto, was jumping up and trying to see through the window, before eventually the donkey, taking a little bit of pity on him, dangled his tail low, and Otto bit onto the tail, and Heinz swished him up in the air so he could land on the donkey's back. And there all four of them were peering through the window. And it was at that juncture that one of the robbers, casually turning round to pick up another sack of ill-gotten gains, happened to glance vaguely in the direction of the window. And the window was filthy, and maybe that contributed. But what did the robber see? Eyes. Lots and lots of eyes, big eyes and little eyes and medium-sized eyes, reflecting light through the window. A many-eyed, black, blurring thing peering through the window. And whilst that robber was brave enough when it came to terrorising little old ladies out of their life savings, when that robber was presented with this great, blurring, multi-eyed monstrosity peering through the windows, he screamed like a schoolgirl and dropped the bag he had just picked up, and coins rolled every which way. The other robbers panicked. So, what is it? What is it? And there he was pointing at the window, and they too saw all of these reflecting eyes and this great blurred shape cast out in the moonlight, peering at them through the window. "It is the very devil!" one of them screamed out. "Our sins have found us out." They screamed, they panicked, they jumped up and down, they didn't know what the hell to do. They burst out of the back door, running every which way, some to the left and some to the right and some straight ahead, screaming and gibbering as they went into the night, convinced that the very devil had crept up from the depths of hell to peer at them through the window. Well, Otto and Heinz and Ludwig and Gretel laughed. Well, if they had any socks on, they would have laughed them off. They didn't have any socks, of course, being wild animals, domestic animals. But they had a good laugh, and they thought, well, yeah, there's a candles in there, there's a fire in the fireplace, keeping that cottage warm, and it looks like there's a bit of bedding in the corner over there that the robbers must have dossed down on. We could make use of this place. And so, with a bit of jiggery-pokery, they got the door open, and they went in. They made sure they shut the front door behind them and went and shut the back door too, that the robbers had escaped from. They had no great use for money, so they left it where it was. But they found some food that the robbers had made half a meal of and polished it off between them. They lay down on the bedding, they warmed themselves in front of the fire, and they thought, this cottage is really quite nice. And those robbers with their ill-gotten gains, well, we could find out who the little old lady was and give her life savings back. But some of this, some of it, Lord knows where the rest of this money comes from. All these silver candlesticks and silver plate and gold crosses and whatnot. We could use some of this and barter, get the cottage repaired. We could live quite nicely. We're very old now, none of us are going to last much longer, but we could have a nice, comfortable old age here. Do we really want to go to Bremen and start singing and caterwailing and risking all of the indignities of being mocked and laughed at that amateur musicians have to go through on their search for fame? Maybe we could settle here. And they discussed this late into the night until they had all started to nod off. And it was only as the snores began to emanate around the walls of the cottage that a couple of the robbers got brave enough to think, well, yes, maybe the devil was at the window, but he'll hardly be waiting around 3 hours later. So perhaps it was time to go back to the cottage, round up their cash, and make haste with it. And although all of them had seen the devil, and feared that their sins were catching them up, none of them were sufficiently scared that they wanted to actually give up their life of sin, or restore their ill-gotten gains to the people that they'd taken it from. And so 2 of that gang of robbers crept up to the door. They could still see the last of the candlelight, now that the candles were almost guttering down to their very end. So the candles were still burning, and peering through one of the windows, they could see the glitter of the piles of coins on the table. They breathed a sigh of relief that the demon from hell had not taken their loot with him when he went back down. They creaked open the door, and they took a few steps inside when they heard and at once their knees started knocking, and maybe it was the knocking of their knees, maybe it was when one of them accidentally banged into the table and sent a pile of coins rattling across the floor. But suddenly there was an enormous shape, and they heard the clomp of cloven hooves, and they saw eyes here and eyes there and eyes everywhere reflected in the candlelight. Flapping and panicking and pushing and jostling, they blundered around in the dark, and something clawed, lashed out at one of them, and he yelped in pain as blood gouted from his hands, and something sharp pecked and tore at another one, and something hefty hoofed a great big foot up the backside of one of them and sent him flying across the room, and something sharp, almost like half a mouthful of teeth, landed in the rump of the other one. And whatever demonic entity was in that room, it seemed to have bits and pieces all over the damn place. It was huge, it was enormous, it was spreading every which way. And the robbers, leaving behind them only a trail of urine, fled, screaming and whimpering into the night, abandoning their ill-gotten gains, never to return. And so the 4 musicians of Bremen, come dawn, were able to see the extent of their wealth, and they decided that they would indeed track down the old lady and return her life savings. And as for the rest of it, well, maybe this was a reward for a lifetime of hard work and good service and compensation for the ingratitude of humanity. And so they lived out the remainder of their days in great comfort and friendship and good companionship, not as a boy band in the town of Bremen, although they did occasionally put on concerts for the local elderly and almost stone deaf to listen to, and their efforts were well received.